I was fascinated by the breadth that you of the information in this book. Did it come naturally for you, or out of State of Fear?
Yes, it did. For me, it was a very natural follow-on. When I wrote A State of Fear, I have to say, for me, I had this big epiphany. To see the mass evocation of compliance in people with very draconian rules, which was induced not just by natural fear of a virus and a pandemic. You know, there would be a natural fear and a natural wanting to shelter and stay indoors. We know from Google mobility data people stayed home. It was more than that, of course. It was a deliberate campaign of persuasion, propaganda, nudging, and of course fear-mongering. And seeing how people could be persuaded to completely change their lives, to stay indoors, to stop working, having relationships, seeing family, worshipping, for the most personal parts of their lives, such as births, marriages and deaths, to be dictated by the state. I had a big epiphany, and I thought, my freedom has been an illusion, but my mind is my space, and I will do all I can to control my own mind. So it got to the end of A State of Fear, and I, perhaps naively, tried to persuade the government to investigate its own use of behavioural science through the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, which failed. And of course I've written about all this, you know, non-stop. And the truth is, there's no government white knights. And nobody is coming to save people from manipulation and propaganda. You know, corporations want you to buy brand A, not brand B. Charities want you to give money to them. Social media has set itself up to be as addictive as any slot machine in a casino to keep your attention. And governments are most certainly not above using behavioural science and propaganda on the people it's supposed to serve. And so I think for a lot of people there's a feeling of a net tightening. I think a lot of people relate to what I'm going to say, even though I can't pinpoint it exactly. There's a feeling that something is tightening, that truth is being squashed, that any deviation from the norm is to be punished. And in this time, what do? You know, there's a feeling that society is like a plane in free fall. And when it is, you need to put your own oxygen mask on first. And so I've thought non-stop about basically the state we're in for the last few years. And I came down to the first thing you have to do, you as an individual, is get your house in order. And it starts with your mind. It starts with being an individual, knowing your own mind. And that means understanding how other people seek to control your mind.
One thing I liked about the book is the fact, Patrick, is that you have kind of little suggestions, not rules maybe, but suggestions about what people can do at the end of every chapter.
Yes, absolutely. So it's not all doom and gloom, although there's some of that in there. You know, we're not in a great place, and AI and technology and social media are probably taking us somewhere dark potentially, unless we do something about it. And as Laura said, it's on kind of all of us, each of us, to free our own minds and take responsibility for our thoughts and our behaviors, because if we don't, then someone else will, the nudgers will. So these, and the book kind of does that a little bit, I suppose. We are nudging readers a little bit, but nudging them to take responsibility for themselves, and that's what the tips are for. Because
behavioural science, I mean, it's big business now, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's huge. The WHO, the WEF, the UN, they all have behavioural science departments. They recommend the use of behavioural science. Lots of businesses have their own behavioural scientists in-house, or they consult people like me. And I think generally that's okay for businesses. Personally, obviously I'm biased, but I don't think there's anything really wrong with Coca-Cola nudging you into buying more Coca-Cola. There's kind of a transparency and an honesty there, and that selfishness. But it's when there's a moral imperative, you know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think that's when the use of thought control basically can be quite dangerous.
Well, Coca-Cola don't have a misinformation unit or truth verifiers. They're just trying to make you buy their brand over the other brand. So it's very different when governments do it. I mean, you talk about being big business, and you've just mentioned all the supranational organisations, but I think people don't know how much it's permeated small parts of life. You know, back in 2011, the behavioural scientists who set up the government's behavioural insights team said we should consult with the public on the use of behavioural science. And yet they haven't. You know, here we are, 2023, there's still not been any public consultations. There's not really any democratic mandate to nudge us, but local government also has behavioural scientists. The government agencies have behavioural scientists. So nudge is embedded throughout government.
Do you feel kind of vindicated after the last book, you know, State of Fear? I mean, because basically you were talking about, you know, the nudge unit, and then it's sort of, you know, the whole thing with COVID has sort of been unravelling, hasn't it, really? But that was one aspect. People say, oh, you know, number 10, or the government used this, you know, yeah. And you sort of think, well, you were writing about it long before that.
That's true. So the book came out early in May 2021. I can't claim it's any sort of sweet victory. It's actually it's almost like quite a bitter feeling that people come around to it now. But what I'd actually rather is that there is an unveiling of truth and that people understand what's happening. I mean, you know, we had the leaked WhatsApp messages, Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages that the Telegraph published in the lockdown files, and he talked about scaring the pants off everyone. This is astonishing language for somebody who was the Secretary of State for Health. Now, there were plenty of systematic reviews in the past that showed that the use of fear came with physical and mental consequences, which is why it was most deliberately contraindicated in all pandemic planning before. And he's kind of gleefully talking about deploying a new variant to frighten people to follow the rules. Some people will still double down on that, and I would say that's largely because of cognitive dissonance. It's quite difficult to acknowledge that you might have had the wool pulled over your eyes or be manipulated. It takes some courage to even acknowledge to yourself that you've been manipulated. I mean, we found in the course of researching the book just how many times we've been manipulated ourselves. It was eye-opening. So I think while some people are doubling down, increasingly it's becoming accepted that the government deliberately frighten people to make them follow the rules. And I think it's increasingly a difficult position to hold. Although amazingly, David Halpern gave an interview to the Telegraph last week, and he talked about how it is justified to frighten people if people's brains are, I quote, wrongly calibrated.
What on earth does that even mean?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? It's really interesting language, because what do we calibrate? We don't normally talk about calibrating human beings or mammals or animals. It's as though we're little bits of machinery to be fine-tuned, or social units to be shuffled around a board. But I think if you're the person who enacts these policies, you're probably likely to still be sympathetic to them sometime later, or even maybe be suffering from a massive case of his own personal cognitive dissonance.
You I think said that you sort of had another epiphany, if that's the right, or realization when you were writing this book. You said how many times you are manipulated. What do you mean, throughout the day, or what?
Well, I was quite cognizant of it anyway, you know, working in the industry, but everything is manipulation. Even this conversation, you know, arranging words in a certain order in order to influence.
Framing it, yes.
Exactly. Any kind of communication really is designed to influence people in some way. So you can't not be manipulated is one of the learnings that we had, but you can choose your manipulation. So one of the chapters is choose your illusion. So on Twitter, you can follow angry people, or you can follow successful people, or people who are healthy and have health advice.
Isn't the natural way that people behave is to follow people for confirmation bias? Isn't that right? I mean, I don't seek out people who've got hugely different views to mine now. I'll be honest. Why would I? I feel I know what they are. You know.
I think we can all relate to that. It's unpleasant to have to expose yourself to points of view that feel jarring, but I think there is still a value in it. One thing the book's done for me, and I think it's the same for Patrick, is it's made me more consciously open-minded. I mean, I'm actually seeking out reading material and experiences that take me out of my comfort zone a little bit. There's a quote which I adore, which is in the book, from the businessman Charlie Munger. And he said the human brain is like a human egg. So with a human egg, once the sperm gets in, there's a shut-off device. No more sperm gets into the human egg. And the human brain is a bit like that. We allow ourselves to be fertilized by an idea, and then we're not open-minded to new ideas. But actually, one of the best things you can do to free your mind is to consciously be open-minded and to take on new ideas and experiences. Can be a little bit uncomfortable, but it's worth trying.
Yes, there were a few areas in the book. I'm always thinking of the people who are viewers here and the people who are involved to support NCF. Just to fill you in, we just started these local branches, right? And one of the reasons we have is that people who watch the channel, the most, definitely the most popular complaint about modern life is feeling isolated if they do not go along with, as you said, what it seems to be an increasingly narrow set of kind of rules. And so we wanted to create, I know, dare I say it, safe spaces for people to get together, and it's proving enormously popular. But in one chapter in the book, you talk about how people should speak up, and I think this is germane to what I'm talking about. Obviously they should, but isn't it very difficult for people to speak up? I mean, in what context should they speak up, do you think?
Well, one thing I would say, there's a principle in the book which is called disrupt and reframe, or destroy then rebuild. So generally you have to break things down before building them back up again. And that's really the essence of pure brainwashing. If you put people in a POW camp, you kind of bombard them, you play rock music all night, whatever it might be, and then because they're so worn down, you can implant new ideas. The point to your question being, yes, it's difficult and it's painful to speak up, but you can create new things in the ashes, as it were. So I wrote an article in March 2020 or April 2020 about how face masks have negative psychological effects. I was a bit passionate, so I called it.
I was going to say, don't miss out the title, Patrick.
The excellent title, "Face Masks Make You Stupid."
This is how I found Patrick.
Nice
I thought,
balanced,
this is interesting. He's polemic, and it was a very well referenced article.
I put a lot of thought into it.
Yep.
I thought about it a lot, yes, and I referenced it. A lot of people didn't like it, surprisingly enough. I lost friends.
Really?
I certainly lost business contacts, and I can put a monetary figure on some of the work that I lost, and it was quite painful. However, from that, I did make some great new friends and new business relationships, new opportunities came out of it, and they were a lot better, really, because they were vibrating with truth, as it were.
Can I say, it's a really interesting point. There's so much we can say about speaking up first, about social conformity, because of course social conformity is fundamental to behavioural science and nudging, and it runs throughout the book. But I mean, at the same time that Patrick wrote that, I decided to create a kind of an art project where I photographed people, including myself, wearing masks that were embroidered with words like obedience, purity, conformity, to show that faith masks were becoming a vestiture of faith. They were becoming an article of faith rather than being based on science. And so at the same time we were doing these kind of different things, and I came across Patrick. I interviewed him for A State of Fear. We stayed in touch, and I said, I've got this idea for a book I want to write to help people protect their minds from manipulation, and he had been developing the same kind of idea for a book. I also lost work, and professional contacts and friendships were impacted by the stance I took at times over lockdown and masks. Nothing I said has turned out to be wrong as such, but it was challenging at the time for people, and speaking up first can come with costs. What I will say is, if you find yourself ejected from one group, that group appears to offer safety because everyone is saying the same thing. We're all drawn to being in a crowd where there's informational conformity and social conformity. But in a way, you can't rely on people that require you to say the same thing. If you leave that group, if you say something different, if you put your head above the parapet, you will find other people that have also gone out on a limb. And do you know what? Those people are people with integrity who you can trust. You find yourself in a new in-group of out-groupers. So you don't just find yourself out on your own, never to make friends ever again. There are always positives as well as negatives from speaking up. But the reason we included that chapter is that free thinking and free speech are really quite symbiotic. There's a lot of talk about free speech, and thank goodness, because it's vital. We have a free speech union in this country that does really important things. I'm a paid up member, and people can fight legal battles. And do you want to pick up, Patrick, on the importance of social conformity in behavioural science?
Yeah, so social conformity is a key pillar of behaviour change, really. There are certain things which make people more likely to do something, it being easy or seeming easy. there being some kind of emotional steam in the engine driving them forward, but also the perception of norms. So is everyone else doing this? Is it the done thing, the default? Is it the inductive norm, which means the thing you ought to do, the ethical thing? But what it really comes down to is that people like to be liked and they like to be right. And these are really two drivers of behavior.
They like to be right and they like to be liked, but they also want to be, would you say, morally correct, even though they wouldn't put it that way.
Yeah.
Seen to be morally correct.
Well, everyone believes their beliefs, really. Everyone thinks they're more or less doing the right thing. But I think what's interesting is you talked earlier about people feeling increasingly disconnected and isolated thanks to technology. I think this moral virtue signaling, whatever you want to call it, it comes from a place of powerlessness, and it's a way of having power over other people. So I had a lecture once at university, which, as you probably imagine, is quite left-wing with the students, and I was talking about segmentation, so putting people into different groups. And one of the students put her hand up and she said, "This is really problematic, I find it offensive." And it's like the entire power dynamic shifted to her. And that's when I realized that this is actually kind of a power move, and I think it comes from people who feel powerless.
Yes, which also